All right, let's take what we've learned already about pressure breaths and let's review that material, but add a few unique concepts that'll make you really talented at breathing for people in any sort of pressure mode of ventilation that delivers pressure breaths. And we'll also tackle pressure support today. So, what we talked about in the last video is that the pressure breath is easy to remember because it's how you and I breathe, but a little bit backwards. You can see in the picture, we can hook up a soda bottle and use our diaphragm to expand this middle balloon, or we can use our mouths and inflate the balloon. The ventilator, of course, uses our mouths, or positive pressure, to inflate the balloon. And the way that looks on flow waveforms is that we have a fixed pressure that, of course, then turns on, and it delivers that pressure for a set amount of time, and then the breath turns off. And the flow, what the patient gets in terms of airflow, is variable, and it's variable based on compliance. We talked about last time how that compliance looks like decelerating flow. When your lungs are empty, they're very compliant to breathe in. And so when you apply this fixed pressure, you get a lot of flow. And as the lungs fill up with positive pressure, the downhill gradient of pressure goes down, right? The lungs are filling with positive pressure, so the difference in pressure between the ventilator and the lungs decreases. And the lungs are filled up, so they're not compliant anymore. The chest wall's pushing in, the lung is stretched out, you get decelerating flow, and the breath ends, and you breathe out in backwards direction during an exhalation. We talked endlessly about how V equals IR explains this really well, V being the pressure gradient between the ventilator and the lung, I being airflow, and R being resistance. It's important to remember when we think about mechanical ventilation that the vent doesn't know the difference between the chest wall and the lung. And so we have to think about compliance not just with regards to the airway disease or the lung problem that's happening, but in terms of the entire patient. And we can improve our resistance by doing simple things like sitting patients upright if they have belly weight that's pushing on the diaphragm, or turning people prone in ARDS. There's lots of things we can do that don't necessarily treat the lung, but treat other ways to help the ventilator deliver safe breaths, and sometimes help the lung. Just a reminder, again, I'm going to rush through these concepts during this to focus on other things, but the thumbprint under this waveform is about equal to the tidal volume, exactly equal to, in fact. So if you want a bigger breath, that thumbprint should be bigger. Here's an example of a pressure breath. We see pressure turns on, you get decelerating flow, and you breathe out passively. So, we reviewed that you can mess up when you're setting the inspiratory time and make the breath really, really long, in which case at some point that flow will keep decelerating, but it will decelerate all the way to zero and you get an inspiratory pause. It's important to remember that an inspiratory pause doesn't add pressure. The pressure is set. It's set by you. And it doesn't add volume because it's simply holding your breath full. It's breathing like this. So it's sometimes uncomfortable, but the biggest issue is that we don't have really any time to breathe out. So if we do this over and over again, we breathe in, we breathe part way out, and we breathe in again, and pretty soon the lung is constantly filled. And if your lung is filled, you can't get preload back into the chest and thorax. And you don't have time to breathe out, so you're really not ventilating much. And so your CO2 will go up. Here's an example of an inspiratory pause. This one isn't bad. We're not air trapping. There's just an inspiratory pause because the patient has pediatric-sized tidal volumes and probably adult-sized inspiratory time. I don't see any air trapping. And some people do ventilate, in fact, using an intentional inspiratory pause. It can help CO2 clearance. You have a moment of total recruitment. It can increase your mean airway pressure, which it can be used in lieu of PEEP. Most of us don't do that very much anymore. But again, the problem is that if we run into long expiratory times, we don't have time to breathe out. And what we see here is where the patient has fixed pressure, and another pressure breath. But at the bottom, they breathe in normal. They don't breathe out all the way. And they breathe in again, but if their lungs are partway filled, that breath is a little smaller. And here it gets bigger and bigger because as you keep air trapping, if you set the respiratory rate too fast, it will keep happening. And so here they maybe gained 25 milliliters of air in their lung. But now they have to breathe out 25 more milliliters of air in the same amount of time. And if they can't, now you're catching that plus maybe another 25 milliliters. And your breathing in gets smaller and smaller. And here you're going to lose preload because the blood can't come into a chest that's full of pressure. And you are not going to ventilate very well. We can see our tidal volumes getting lower and lower. Plus, it's just uncomfortable. On the other hand, we can leave the inspiratory time way too short. It gives us a small tidal volume. And the only way to overcome that small tidal volume is by adding a lot of pressure and making the flow waveform taller. So if I want to make this thumbprint the same size as that, this thumbprint the same size as that, I have to go up and make it taller. And we can get what I always look at as free tidal volume, or in other words, more tidal volume for the same pressure, simply by increasing the inspiratory time. When patients are on light sedation or even deeply sedate, they often help you by breathing along with the ventilator. When we look at our V equals IR equation, that will decrease the resistance. The vent doesn't have to move the chest wall anymore, and the vent is getting help from the diaphragm. And what that looks like is less resistance, and if the V is fixed, the flow has to get taller, and that's all that happens. That's a reminder that the flow is always variable based on compliance, but last time what I didn't tell you is that when the ventilator delivers a pressure breath, I'm kind of lying a little bit. Vents always deliver flow. They don't really deliver pressure. They simply deliver enough flow, or they try to give enough flow to meet your pressure goal. And most of the time that works quite well. But if the patient's sucking in air, sometimes the vents are not pulling enough airflow from the wall to actually meet that goal. And so the vents try to keep up. But really the right way to call a flow pressure breath is pressure targeted flow. And sometimes that's not enough. Let's look at what that looks like. Here's a normal pressure breath. We see a nice decelerating flow. And if I transition from, say, being paralyzed to breathing along with the vent, the resistance will decrease and the flow will simply get bigger, right? We'll get more flow. But if you start to breathe heavily, things change. One of the key things to look for when you're starting to see a patient work with you on the ventilator is whether that slope of that waveform looks like it's skiing down a hill. Because when they start breathing heavily, the first thing you notice is the flow looks like it's jumping off of a cliff. So instead of these nice breaths where you go, you get jumping off a cliff. It's very easy to see at the bedside. Let's look at a picture of that. Here we have pressure. It turns on, goes for a set amount of time, and the patient's working really hard and jumping off that cliff at the end. But it doesn't stop there. Patients that are strong or really air hungry can pull even more flow, and sometimes it's more than the ventilator can keep up with. That looks like this. The vent turns on. It should look like a square waveform. And I notice it doesn't, right? The flow looks like they're jumping off a cliff. And the vent can't keep up with how much flow that patient wants, and so it can't reach the goal pressure. And it's a negative inflection on the pressure waveform, which should be pretty fixed. This is intense inspiratory work of breathing. Now, mind you, this has another problem with it that you can learn about when we look at other dysynchronies in those lectures. We notice that the flow cuts off before the breathing out. It's a type of inspiratory pause. But here, the biggest thing to notice is that the patient is flow starved on pressure control. Here's a video of that in real life. We notice the patient does this every breath. Red and green is happy, they're triggering every breath, and the vent can't keep up, which I'm teaching somebody at the bedside. Here's yet another example. This one's less dramatic, but it's still there. We see jumping off the cliff, and we notice that the pressure cannot keep up with how much flow the patient wants. Another example of inspiratory work of breathing. So, the final slide I left with last time was how can I get the most volume for the least pressure? Or if we just want to go up on the pressure, what do we do? Well, the simplest way to get a bigger breath on a pressure breath or a bigger tidal volume on a pressure breath is to just go up on the pressure. If we go up on how much pressure we deliver, the flow goes up. Pretty straightforward. The second thing we try to do is decrease the resistance, and we do that by treating underlying conditions, by making the lung better, healthier, diuresing, treating chest wall edema, taking patients that have belly weight, sitting them upright a little bit, and all of those things for the same pressure will look just like that pattern from increasing the pressure, right? The same phenomenon. You get more flow, but this time for the same pressure. If the patient takes that to the next level, you can see increased work of breathing by looking for that jumping off a cliff waveform, and even flow starvation where the vent can't keep up on the pressure waveform. And finally, we look to adjust the inspiratory and expiratory times. And what I said last time is if you call this peak around 100%, if I'm going to pick the inspiratory time, I try to aim for a point in the decelerating flow of around 25% or so of that peak flow. If we make it way too short, we're missing out on free tidal volume. And if you make it way too long, you don't have time to breathe out. Now, I told you we could do one extra type of breath today, and it's the pressure support breath. Pressure support breaths are really easy modifications of a pressure breath. You deliver a fixed amount of pressure, and they're generally synchronized to the patient breathing. Either the vent will trigger the breath based on negative pressure, or by positive airflow from the ventilator to the patient, both effort dependent. You can adjust those triggers, but they're generally these breaths are generally triggered by the patient. Then, every bit of the physiology stays the same for a pressure support breath to a regular pressure breath. But the way they turn off is distinct. You don't hear the word control in a pressure support breath, and that's because you're not controlling the inspiratory time. So here, what the vent does is it turns off that pressure at a set flow percent. Let's talk about that. The vent looks at the peak flow and calls that flow 100%, and then it watches the flow decelerate. And when that flow decelerates to 30% on most ventilators, the breath will turn off. So instead of being time cycled or turning off based on time, these are flow cycled. They turn off based on flow. You can adjust that flow percent that it turns off based on. But most of the time, 30% works, especially for adults. So what happens if the patient coughs on a pressure support mode of ventilation? Well, coughing is breathing at the ventilator, so equivalent to breathing out. It goes down. Of course, it'll go below 30% because it's breathing at the ventilator, and the vent will stop trying to breathe in for the patient. On the other hand, if you try to get more volume, let's say the patient wants to take that big every once in a while breath, they can. As the vent turns itself on, they get a breath, and then let's say they suck in a little more, the vent keeps supporting them with a little bit of that positive pressure. Now, in general, most patients will land at a pretty fixed inspiratory time breath to breath. So while it's flow cycled instead of time cycled, most patients pick the same time approximately and kind of live there most of the time. And that's pressure support. Pretty straightforward. I hope that was useful as a little bit more advanced approach to pressure breathing and for mostly a review of the basic concepts of pressure breaths. Happy ventilating!